Hello. In this video, I'm going to be talking about two hormones, aldosterone and ADH. Aldosterone is a hormone that you guys have already learned in the stress response video, but I'm going to talk about it again today because it is an important hormone when we talk about blood pressure changes, and it also does a very similar thing to this other hormone that we haven't talked about yet called ADH. So I want to make another video to show just aldosterone by itself and include it with ADH because they do two things that are very, very similar. So to start off, I want to bring you back to the nephron, which is the tubules and whatnot in the kidney. And this is a process where you guys learned in Bio 20 where we have fluid flowing through the nephron and we will reabsorb things into the blood, or we will send things from the blood into the nephron, and eventually, as it moves through the nephron, create urine and then go into the collecting duct, and that collecting duct will go to the renal pelvis, which will connect to the ureters and down into the bladder. Okay, so that's the process that we're doing today. But this time we have to talk about what hormones control some of that water reabsorption. So our two hormones are ADH and aldosterone. They specifically come into the distal tubule, which is kind of the second last place in our nephron. They also come into the collecting duct, and they will tell water to be reabsorbed back into our blood from these two specific places in our nephron. So these two hormones get stimulated when there's a decrease in blood pressure. So if your blood pressure goes down, you might start feeling a little bit lightheaded or faint, and you have to bring your blood pressure back up to normal, which is around 120/80. And one of the things that we can do in order to change our blood pressure is change the amount of water in our blood. So if there's more water, it's going to be moving faster, which means that your blood pressure is going to be higher. So when it pulls water into our blood with ADH and aldosterone, it's going to increase our blood pressure back to a normal level, which means that our blood pressure should be around 120/80 at this point, and then we no longer need those hormones for that moment. We'll let the blood pressure be normal, and if it drops again, then we can increase the output of ADH and aldosterone so that we can put water back into our blood. So ADH and aldosterone are used to control our blood pressure levels using a negative feedback loop mechanism, just like all of the other hormones that we talked about in this unit. So aldosterone is the first feedback loop that I wanted to do. So it is going to be stimulated if there's a decrease in blood pressure, but also is a long-term stress hormone. And it is the thing in long-term stress that causes your blood pressure to increase. Okay? Today we're going to be talking more about it just when it's normally released, if we just have a blood pressure change. So it's going to go to the hypothalamus, which is looking at the blood pressure levels, and that signal from the hypothalamus is going to go to the anterior pituitary gland, which is going to release our hormone ACTH, which is a tropic hormone that is a messenger hormone that tells the adrenal glands to actually release this hormone called aldosterone. So aldosterone is going to be released, and it's from the adrenal gland, which is those little tiny hats that sit on top of the kidney. So that hormone is going to be released into the blood and then travel directly down into the kidneys, just right below. Specifically in the kidneys, remember we're going into the nephron, but inside the nephron into the distal tubule and the collecting duct. So it's going to tell sodium in our nephron to go back into the blood. Okay? Aldosterone doesn't have the ability to actually communicate with water. The end goal is to bring water back into the blood, but it doesn't have the ability to say, hey, water, come over here. So if it moves sodium into the blood, and there's a really high concentration of sodium in the blood, naturally water will follow and try to even out that concentration. So water will come from the nephron into the blood as well, which will increase the amount of water in the blood, which will in turn increase the blood pressure back to a normal level. So that is what aldosterone does. The other hormone that we need to talk about is the antidiuretic hormone, okay, which is stimulated by low amounts of water in the bloodstream or low blood pressure. So that's going to go to the hypothalamus, which is in charge of watching the levels of blood pressure in your body. It also actually creates the ADH, and the posterior pituitary will store the ADH and release it. So it's going to communicate with the posterior pituitary gland, which is the only time we get to use the posterior pituitary gland in chapter 13, hormones. So that's exciting and easy to remember. ADH is the only one you have to remember that comes from there. That's going to go and release that hormone ADH, and it's going to travel through our blood all the way down into our kidneys and the blood vessels in our kidneys. So again, remember that in our kidneys, it's specifically inside the nephron, and it's dealing with the distal tubule and the collecting duct. So what it's going to do is it's going to specifically tell the water that's in our nephron to come into the blood so that we can change our blood pressure back to a normal amount. Okay, so that we have a higher blood pressure, closer to 120/80. So antidiuretic hormone, the actual name, antidiuretic means that it's the opposite of a diuretic. And a diuretic is something that makes you pee a lot. So an antidiuretic is going to make you pee less. Okay, we don't want to pee out all of our water because that wouldn't be very good. We would get super dehydrated if that happened. So an antidiuretic is something that's going to come into our body and tell us to pee less, which it does by taking the water from our nephron and putting it back into our blood so we can keep it into our bloodstream and not have it in our urine and excrete it in our urine. So just like every other hormone, okay, here's another picture of it just to show that it's like a negative feedback loop mechanism. Obviously, we're not going to keep releasing ADH to bring our blood pressure back to way too much high, because obviously if there's too much water and too high of blood pressure, that's not going to be a good thing either. So we're just going to release ADH when it's needed. When we need to bring the blood pressure back to a normal, once it hits normal, we're going to turn it off. Okay, and we're going to release it maybe again later.